Washington, Washington,
Washington, Washington, Washington, Washington, Washington, or Washington's Washington, Washington, Washington's Washington, or Washington, Times, Washington, Washington, story, Washington, story, Washington, the time, Washington, 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 Washington's time, Washington, Washington's Washington, Washington, time, Washington, or time, Washington, the Washington, or Washington, Washington, or Washington, time, Washington, Washington, or Washington, time,
Washington,
Washington, story, Washington,
Washington,
or Washington, Washington,
Washington time,
the House,
Anderson,
story, Washington, Anderson,
by time, Anderson House, the House, story, Washington, the time, in Washington, Anderson House in Washington, story, by time, in Washington, Anderson story, the House in Washington, her story in time, the story, the Anderson's time, her time, a store in Washington's house, Washington, the House, story, house, the House, the Times house, the Washington, the House,